Hello, hello, everybody. Welcome to the New York State Trustee Handbook Book Club, or welcome back if you've been here before. I'm your host, Ron Kursop. Tonight, I will be asking your questions about governance structure, board officers, and board committees. The New York State Trustee Handbook Book Club aims to equip the over 6,000 library trustees in New York with a deeper understanding of their roles and responsibilities. Each session delves into a specific chapter of the trustee handbook, addressing real-world governance questions and providing valuable insights, or at least we try to. I see many of you have already started to say hello in the chat box, which is great. So please introduce yourself, share your name, your library, your tenure as a trustee, and just for fun, you can go ahead and throw in there on how many trustee handbook book clubs you've attended so far. I'll be really impressed if somebody has made all of them. That would be really great. You'll also find the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll discuss that feature in a minute. I want to express our sincere gratitude for our co-promotional sponsors, the New York State Library, the Public Library Systems Director Organization, the Library Trustee Association, and the Public Library section of NYLA. Their support and collaboration have been instrumental in the success of tonight's event. Thank you all. And while we're on the topic of promotion, I would like to promote a couple upcoming events that we have. And I'd like you to mark your calendars for two trustee handbook book club things that are coming up. The first one in December, we are going to record the fourth after party and then release it shortly after that. These are the sessions that we will be addressing all the questions that couldn't be answered during our live session. So be on the lookout for that. It is pre-recorded, so you don't have to worry about registering. That'll just come up. And then on January 22nd, 2025, we will join us for a live session at 5 p.m. on advocacy. And that will be on the Mid-Hudson Library website with the Trustee Handbook Book Club information. So we hope that you can come to that one. We're hoping that it'll be a really great opportunity to talk about advocacy as we go into the library advocacy season this year. So tonight, we will delve into the board officers and committee section of the trustee handbook. Our favorite speaker, Rebecca Smith-Aldrich, author of the trustee handbook, will provide an overview of this critical topic and address frequently asked questions submitted by our viewers. After Rebecca's presentation, I'll facilitate an open Q&A session for those attending live. You can submit any questions that you have using the Q&A feature below. I'll grab them out of there and ask Rebecca, and then we'll see if we can get an answer for them. Any general comments, you can go ahead and drop them right in the chat feature too. Due to the anticipated volume of questions, we may not be able to address all of them during tonight's session. However, we will certainly try to in the book club after party that I mentioned earlier. And so for our team, so tonight we have Laura Chrissy of the Mid-Hudson Library System, who spoke a little bit earlier. She'll be providing technical support, and then myself, Ron Kursop from Owl Library System, will moderate. And then, as I said earlier, our favorite Rebecca Smith-Aldrich is here, our presenter and library expert. She's the executive director of the Mid-Hudson Library System. And along with co-authoring the Handbook for Library Trustees of New York State, she also authored the Compendium Handbook for New Library Directors in New York State and the Municipal Ballot How-To Guide, as well as two other books for ALA editions. At this time, I'd like to invite Rebecca to kick us off with our next installment of the Trustee Handbook Book Club. Take it away, Rebecca.
Thanks, Ron, and thanks, Laura. Welcome back, everyone. I'm curious to see if anyone in the chat says they've been to all of these. I guess that's bingo. I don't know. But we wanted to break down some of the newer content in the trustee handbook for you this evening, because we actually had a great suggestion from one of our editorial board members, Kevin Verbesey, down at the Suffolk Cooperative Library System. He said, "You've never talked about committees in the handbook." And we're like, yeah, we should do that. So that's part of what we're going to cover here tonight. But first, we're going to take a look at the officer roles on the board, just covering the traditional roles of officers on your board, answer some questions you've got about that. I can imagine you're going to have a lot of questions in this area after I'm done. And then we'll talk about committees. and the best practices for committees, the origin statement of committees, and how they intersect with open meetings law, which is often something that you don't want to know the answer on, but you're going to get tonight. So again, we'll take a little bit of time here to cover the basics, and then we'll dive into the questions that you have. Our goal is to spend far more time on your questions than me yapping at you on these topics, but there's some basic stuff that I thought I could cover that would head off some of the more basic questions. So let's start off with the role of the board officers, because that really is where the leadership of the board sits, is in those officer positions. And many of these you are very familiar with, and so this is not going to be really new information to you, but we're talking about the president, vice president, treasurer, and secretary. Now, not all of your boards may have a vice president, but it is a best practice to have someone in that role to step in if the board president is unable to attend a meeting, or also to think about succession planning when your board president steps down from that role or leaves the board. So we'll review each of these roles as we go through the information here tonight. But really, as always, it's a team, right? It's a team effort to produce a quality library board experience for everyone. And there's key roles with general assignments that, if they're carried out, things generally go pretty well. And that really does start with the board president. Thinking about that role, it's really critical role for the board to be operating well, to have someone who's really on top of things, oversees the work of the board, understands their role at meetings, which is to facilitate that meeting, make sure you get through the business of the evening or day in a timely manner, in a way that makes sure everyone is heard and consensus is reached, and is keeping all the communication flowing amongst board members, whether it's individual board members or committees, but they're kind of the traffic cop to kind of understand what's going on where, delegating things as well as bringing information back, helping committees be successful to know what resources they have at their beck and call. So this term ex officio, which you may or may not be familiar with, means that automatically the board president is a member of each committee. Perhaps not a voting member unless you need someone to break a tie, but they should be aware and included in communication about all committee activities on your board, so they're in the loop of what's going on. They might not be able to make all the committee meetings, but they should be in the know of what's going on. The president's also the point person with your director. So we've often talked in this series about the relationship between the board and the director and how critical that relationship is. But when we've got issues or directives, or we've got concerns, that's usually being funneled from the board to the board president to the director. In New York State, boards can be anywhere between 5 members to 25 members, and we've got a library in my system with 25 members. And so just thinking about the life of a director and what it would be like if 25 trustees were coming at them as if they are the boss and the number one point of contact, you can see how that would be very unwieldy. So funneling communication to the board president, having the board president being the primary point of communication with the director between meetings is really, really key. Now, the board president may also be assigned as the spokesperson for the institution, maybe the board in particular, but also maybe that designated person along with the director who can speak on behalf of the institution. And that should be defined in your policies, whether you have a public relations policy or a media policy, one way or the other, that should be made very clear who speaks for the board. Of course, individual trustees are welcome to their opinions, but in the press should always be making clear when they're speaking about their opinions versus the standing on an issue of the entire board. That's something probably only the president should be speaking about and designated as such through your policies. Now, in this area of taking the lead that I itemized here for you, I did this because I think there's such a wide variety of size of boards in New York State. We've got folks that, you're on a board maybe with only 5 people, up to, as I mentioned, boards with 25 people, and we've got everything in between. So how you carry out the work may look a little different from library to library, but the board president wants to take responsibility to make sure certain things happen on a regular basis. Not only the meetings are happening, but that we're getting those annual tasks done that are really good for the health of the board and the institution. That annual director performance evaluation, the annual board self-evaluation, and making sure they're taking the lead on board recruitment and board orientation. That doesn't mean they do it all themselves, but they're the ones making sure it is happening and asking others to help them do that work along the way. So thinking about that role and where the responsibilities lie, this is kind of a general outline of it, your mileage may vary depending on the various issues your board is tackling in this moment. But the board president is really that organizer, facilitator, the person who's a communications hub for your board to make sure folks know what's going on, or delegating things to others that will make sure everyone knows what's going on. And I did do a little call out box here just to remind you that in Education Law 260D, which is the law that oversees the education requirements for trustees now, the board president is named as the person to make sure all of the trustees on your board is in compliance with that law. So your policy that you've adopted about trustee education may delegate that to the secretary or the director, but the board president needs to make sure it's actually happening on an annual basis to make sure you're in compliance with that law and in good standing. Now, the key attributes here, we already touched on so many of these, but as all of you know who have ever been to a meeting, the person sitting at the head of the table to run that meeting, they better be a good listener so they understand where people are coming from and how to facilitate a discussion to consensus, or to make sure everyone has been heard, but doing so in a timely and efficient manner. They have to be highly organized in order to get through the variety of topics that come their way as the board president and might be on the agenda. They need to understand who the best spokespeople are for things, where to turn for help on things. But again, really good communicator, treating that meeting very professionally, making sure we get through the business of the day in a timely and efficient and professional manner, and making sure we're actually really aware of the library's policies, right? Boards that have come before you have done good work to help guide the work of the board and the organization itself. And so heightened awareness of those policies, making sure they're being respected, is really important. Because as we think about the mission of our libraries and why you have volunteered to be on a library board, it comes back to the mission and making sure we're being transparent and accountable in the way we do the work of our libraries. So keeping the mission at the heart of what you do, respecting the policies and the long-range plan of the institution, that should help guide you through many maybe sticky issues that you're confronted with, or when you hit a roadblock and you're not quite sure what to do. Reflecting back on your mission, why we're here to do the work on behalf of our neighbors, is often a very helpful compass setting, particularly for board presidents that are trying to guide us sometimes through very difficult conversations. Now, delegation, as you know, any manager needs to be a good delegator. And in many senses of the word, the board president is a manager of board operations. And so being really clear when to delegate to the vice president, to a committee chair, to the director, helping work get done, again, in a timely and efficient manner. And now I know it sounds boring, but you do know we devoted last November's session of the Trustee Handbook Book Club to Robert's Rules of Order, or parliamentary procedure. It sounds very dry and antiquated, but it really does help move things along. It helps depersonalize issues that may crop up, and it's certainly a tool in the toolbox of the board president to run the board business meetings for sure. Now, the vice president, obviously, not every board has one, but it is a really good idea because they are there. They're very aware of what's going on. They're in the loop on what's facing the board, and they're able to step in if the board president is sick or on vacation. You've got a clear chain of command on the board for someone to step into that role when necessary. And then again, succession planning for stepping up into that role when the current board president steps down, leaves the board, whatever your pattern is there for that particular role on your board. And then, of course, other duties as assigned. You know, the board president is one person, and obviously a very dedicated person, but needs support. And so the vice president can often be that person that helps with a larger project, or keeping things organized, or filling in a meeting or two that the board president can't make it to. So again, vice president may or may not be outlined in your bylaws, but I would recommend having someone in that role. It can really help strengthen your board and stabilize it for the long term as you have turnover. Now, the secretary role can look a little different from library to library as well. And here are some of the key things I just wanted to say about the secretary role. Now, I've got folks in my system who are secretary who pretty much don't do anything. The director kind of takes care of it all. There's a paid staff person who comes in and takes the minutes. The board secretary just kind of signs off on the minutes and says, yeah, that reflects what I heard at that meeting. It can range from that kind of experience all the way up to and including almost a corresponding secretary involvement, which I'll describe here in a sec. But at the end of the day, the number one thing we want to make sure secretaries are on top of is compliance with New York State open meetings law? Are we actually posting our meeting notices the way we should as per the law? Are we getting a draft of the board meeting minutes done within 2 weeks after that meeting and posted to the website, which is now a requirement of that law? Those are the two key things we want to make sure secretaries are on top of. Whether or not that board secretary actually writes the draft of the minutes, maybe they do, maybe there's a paid staff person that's helping to do that work. Sometimes even the director is helping out with that work. So it may look a little different, but the secretary is responsible for making sure that draft is done at least 2 weeks after that board meeting. And again, posted to the library's website. You need to have an archive of your library's board minutes now on the library's website. And yes, I know you won't have approved that draft, but that's again why you want to keep your minutes short and sweet as much as possible. Just the action items are required to be in those minutes. Now, there could be other roles secretaries take on, and this is certainly not mandated. It's more, I think, almost tradition in some places. Sometimes in smaller, more rural libraries, the secretary is the one that's going to the post office to get the mail and is opening it up and like responds to folks that might write into the board about particular issues. In most cases, it's evolved away from that, and directors and staff are really on top of getting the mail, keeping it organized, because obviously bills are coming in. We want to have a good chain of command on those types of things with the paid staff. So again, secretary role can look a little different. Sometimes the secretary is in charge of meeting announcements, making sure all board members know when the meetings are, when the board packet is available, making sure the rosters of your committees are up to date and the tenure of trustees is well documented in terms of when their terms are up and what vacancies you're going to have next year. That's often a role that secretaries play as well. The larger the library, the more likely your director or administrative staff are helping out on those types of things. And then again, letters from the board could be coming from a secretary or the board president or the director, depending on how you do business at your library. But the top thing there, compliance with open meetings law, let's make sure our secretaries on our boards are really on top of that. That's very important. Now, we're going to talk about treasurers, and as you can tell from the last 2 editions of the trustee handbook, we get a lot of questions about the role of treasurers. So I just wanted to preface this part of my mini presentation with 3 words, which is separation of duties. This is the goal, as I am about to show you an overly complicated chart of the role of treasurers on our boards. Just keep in mind, the goal is separation of duties so that no one person has so much control over the library's finances that they could be absconding with money, pocketing money, moving money into their own account or the accounts of a family without appropriate oversight in your organization. So everything around the role of the treasurer is designed to play a role on what I would refer to as almost a finance team of your library. And what it looks like in your situation, it first may be different based on the type of library that you are. So this chart I'm going to put in front of you is actually a summary of the information that you find in the trustee handbook. So as you look at the screen, and maybe you want to take a picture of it with your phone, just a reminder, you get a copy of the slides, a recording of this, you got the trustee handbook to refer to, and you can ask questions while we're here tonight, or even email us later if you have more questions. But this hopefully looks the way it does at your library, but it may not, which is why I'm talking slowly and making you feel okay about what's about to happen. Now, over half the libraries in New York State are association libraries, and trustees that are currently sitting on the board can serve as the treasurer. So your peers on the board, someone can step up to be treasurer in that situation. The other 3 types of libraries, which are legally called public libraries, have a different standard they need to adhere to, and it can look a little different depending on some variables that I just wanted to walk us through here. We're going to go from left to right, starting with municipal public libraries. Municipal public libraries in New York State are the most rare type of library in New York State, primarily because most municipal libraries have graduated to a district library model, which is recommended by the New York State Library. Those municipal libraries that are still lingering in New York State can have different experiences with their municipality. Some of them are very independent. The funds are turned over from the municipality right to the library treasurer, and then those funds are managed internally through invoicing, warrants. You are managing that in-house. In that situation, an independent treasurer is recommended, primarily a paid treasurer that comes in and manages that money for the municipal public library. And then a trustee can be designated as a finance officer who works hand in hand with that paid independent treasurer. In the situations of municipal libraries where the town or the municipality is retaining the money, technically the treasurer of that municipality is the board treasurer. And then you can also have a trustee be that finance officer who's the primary liaison with the municipal treasurer. So that's a layer of complication for an organization that sometimes is not necessary in a very small library setting. Sometimes you're grateful for it. But again, it can look different from library to library across the state. But just keep in mind, we want separation of duties. An independent treasurer may be something some of you have not considered before, but is recommended by the Office of the State Comptroller. In the situation of the district libraries, you've got the school district public library, and you've got multiple scenarios here, just like we did with the municipal situation. One in which the school district treasurer can also be the library treasurer. This is insanely rare. It's really, really rare. The school district honestly doesn't want much to do with the school district public library. They just want to turn that money over and do their thing with the school district. So I think that's a very antiquated model. I'd be surprised actually if anyone here is in that situation, but I'm certainly surprised on a regular basis, so that could totally happen here tonight. But more frequently, what you've got is the school district acting as the tax collection agency for the library, turning over the money to the library's treasurer, which again, the Office of the State Comptroller recommends that be an independent and most likely paid treasurer. And then you've got a member of the elected board of trustees who's assigned as the finance officer, who's the primary liaison with that independent paid treasurer. So again, helping with that separation of duties. So in the special district situation, special districts are special, which means you always have to read your special district legislation first. It may have very specific instructions about the role of the treasurer and what you must do. So that's your first place to look for answers. If it's silent on the topic, we default to the best practices of the Office of the State Comptroller, in which they recommend an independent, most likely paid treasurer is hired by the board to be the treasurer, and then one of your elected trustees is appointed as the finance officer to be the liaison with that treasurer, again, facilitating the separation of duties. And quite frankly, in some of the larger libraries in our state, the financial know-how that you need may not be on the board of elected or appointed people that you have as peers on the board. So this is asking for that professional role of an independent, most likely paid treasurer in this situation as well. Now, I know firsthand, because some of the libraries in my system are this way, they don't have that independent paid treasurer. So again, going back to that idea of the goal here is separation of duties. If the Office of the State Comptroller came knocking on your door and said, well, we said you were supposed to have an independent paid treasurer and you don't, if you're able to demonstrate excellent separation of duties across the activities that happen with the library's finances, they may not ding you on that. They may just say, well, best practice is this, but you've demonstrated a very good practice that achieves what we want here, which is that separation of duties and really strong financial oversight. So for the public libraries that do have independent treasurers, most likely paid, these are not voting members of your board. You are paying them to provide a service to your board to make sure the finances of your library are well taken care of, but they do actually have to take the oath of office. So that is something to add into your compliance calendar along with the trustees and your director and any other staff that are managing finances should be taking the oath of office. And then again, they report to the board. So you don't want to have a staff member who also reports to the director to be the paid independent treasurer. That's going to cause a problem. I guarantee it. And then again, attending board members is at the pleasure of the board. If you want them there to answer questions, you can have that. But oftentimes the finance officer, your peer on the board, has a strong enough understanding of the reports the independent treasurer gives you. They can play that role at the board meeting and you don't have to pay them extra to be there, but that's totally at the discretion of your board. Now, treasurer responsibilities, again, This is recommended. It might look slightly different at your library depending on the other folks on your finance team and how you've designed your separations of duties when it comes to expenditures and receipts of funding for your library. But here's a general description of what the treasurer's responsibilities may be. You're talking about someone who has the responsibility to receive the money from the tax collection agency and deposit it and oversee the disbursement of those funds. Again, using the warrant system that we talked about in the finance workshop and making sure that the full board is aware of how funds are being expended. But then the treasurer is the person that signs off on those once the board has approved them. So they're the lead in making sure you've got strong accounting records being maintained, getting reports to the board that you are able to understand. Really to be able to decipher those and understand them is incredibly important. I know we kind of joked about it at the finance session of the Trustee Handbook Book Club, but question until you understand. That's the general rule for trustees when looking at financial reports. If you don't understand something, ask that question. It can be offline, call on the treasurer, call the director, get the information that you need to feel confident you understand those reports, because you may be the one who asks a question that unveils a problem or recognizes that the report is overly complicated. And honestly, if you can't wrap your head around it, probably the public can't either. And it's much better for those to be transparent and easy to understand for all parties involved. And then oversight of investments. If you've got CDs, remember association libraries have some latitude with investments, but public libraries are pretty locked in to the investment vehicles you can use. You need to use General Municipal Law Section 10 to kind of understand what your options are. So not a ton of investing going on in libraries, but say you have a CD that matures every 3 or 6 months, treasurer's responsibility is to be on top of that renewal pattern and making sure that the cash is available as needed in the library's fiscal year. So the director's role in all of this, and let me just say, I know you have questions about the treasurer. I know it's coming, and that's what we're going to get to as soon as I'm done presenting here. So go ahead and put them in the Q&A section. Ron's going to facilitate those. But your director, who is also a member of your finance team for sure, they're overseeing the day-to-day operations of your library, depending on how deep your bench is of staff. You may have staff that are involved in the finances of the library, but the smaller your library, the less staff that you have, the more responsibility is coming to the board or that independent treasurer. And so again, at least 3 people involved in the oversight of the funds of the library is necessary. So the combo may look a little different from library to library, depending on how large the staff is, what type of library you are. As a trustee, I just want you to always be thinking of that mantra, separation of duties. Let's make sure that one person is in control of everything, who could easily make money disappear to their own personal advantage. Now, your director, as we described very consistently, is the co-leader of your board. They are working hand in hand with the board president to draft the agenda. They are technical advisor at the board table. They are making sure that you've got a compliance calendar so you understand what are the important activities the board needs to engage in and coming up on a regular basis. So they may work with the secretary on doing that work. Directors that are online right now, you might also be saying, well, actually, I've always had to do that myself. That also is valid. That could be the way it works in your library. But directors should be at every single board meeting, and they should be at every single committee meeting, because they are also the hub of not only communication, but information. Trustees can often find themselves wasting a lot of time when if they had just talked to their director about something, you could have gotten timely information or really solid research or information about how other libraries do things. Your director is an incredibly important part of your team in the governance structure of your library. So the board committees are another important element of the governance structure of your libraries. Now, again, this could look different from library to library. As we said, you've got libraries in this state with only 5 members on their board. Creating, scraping together a committee amongst 5 people, might not be an easy thing to do. But we're going to talk about how you can use committees effectively, even if you have a roster that is on the smaller side of that range allowed in New York State. Committees are incredibly powerful in terms of doing work of the board in a way that makes everyone feel more confident about decisions you're going to make in the future. And the idea here is that a smaller group of people can take a topic, dig into it, and bring recommendations back to the board, saving time at the board table and really expediting work of the board long term, or getting more oversight of an issue that you're very responsible for, but also feeling like you don't have enough time in your board meetings to spend the amount of time that it probably needs. So when we take a look at the role of committees, they're not inherently imbued with power. They're advisory groups that make recommendations to your board. And of course, there's an exception to this because it's New York State, right? So the exceptions to this are your executive committee, if you have one of those, and your facilities committee, if you have one of those. There are definitely times when the full board can authorize those committees to make decisions on behalf of the board when it makes sense. So for an executive committee, they might be empowered to make decisions on behalf of the board during a time of crisis. Maybe you've got a director just dropped off the face of the earth, never came to work, and oh my goodness, we've got now a library without a leader. What are we going to do here? You've got to make several decisions very quickly. And so the board may say, we can't convene every single night this week. We need the executive committee to be that smaller team to keep things going. We all understand our goals in this situation. The executive committee understands the intent. We trust you to do that work over the next 2 weeks before we can convene again. Or maybe there's an emergency, there was a fire or a flood at your library. The executive committee, if authorized by the full board, can make some of those quick decisions that need to be made in those moments when you've got really time-sensitive issues that the library is faced with. Now, facilities committee normally would not be authorized to make decisions in between board meetings, but if you're in the middle of a construction project, your director may need a smaller group of the board that's authorized to help them make decisions on a shorter timeline than your board meeting schedule allows for. But again, it's done with the full understanding of the board, and the board votes to authorize the facilities committee to make certain decisions that are going to be defined in that board resolution. So it's super clear. You can make decisions in these areas for this time frame up until whatever, next meeting, or, for the next 6 months, whatever your project may require. But again, it's always authorized by the board, and the scope of the decision-making power is always defined by the board. So there's not like a blank check that the executive committee can just make decisions in between board meetings, only if authorized by the committee, because most things you can see coming. The real issues maybe when you've had a natural disaster impact library operations or facilities, or maybe like a pandemic or something really, really big that happens that was really unexpected. That's when the executive committee can kick into high gear and do their best until the full board can be convened. But again, both groups of that smaller groups of the board need to be insanely respectful of the fact that the board is a collective authority, and they may not take action unless authorized to do so by the full board. So that authorization of committees in general, I thought would be helpful to point out. You probably have standing committees, which are authorized in your bylaws. And those committees should be meeting on a regular schedule. It's good to kind of sketch that out at the beginning of the year, how often your standing committees need to meet. And at your organizational meeting, you should be appointing the roster of those committees. The board president will often draft the roster, talking to people about what committees they want to be on, and then putting forth a recommendation to the board. But the board must approve the roster of either standing or ad hoc committees. Now, ad hoc committees are those that might be necessary for a temporary timeline. So maybe in your bylaws, you have standing committees, but you've got this special project that really does need some oversight of a small group of trustees. The board can vote to authorize an ad hoc committee. And you would say, for the next 12 months, we're going to add on this committee to our committee roster. And we'll vote on who's going to be on that committee. And that committee reports to the board, just like the standing committees do. But that will likely sunset at the end of the year unless reauthorized by the board. So you should see your ad hoc committees annually reauthorized, where your standing committees are authorized into the future because they live in your bylaws. So these are the typical committees. As we mentioned, your executive committee. This is going to be made up of your board officers, but education law has a little curveball there because it actually requires you to have 5 members of an executive committee, which means in addition to the traditional 4 officers, you'd also have to appoint either a member at large or, like on our board here at Mid-Hudson, it can be the immediate past president makes up that 5th position on an executive committee. So again, they may not have to do much in the course of the year, but if you've got some drama going on or you've had an unfortunate series of events befall the library, the executive committee becomes far more important in your organization. Finance, personnel, buildings and grounds, policy, and planning. Those are typical areas of committee work. You might find some of these are combined. You might find you have a policy and planning committee. They cover both things because the planning is cyclical and the level of work is a little different over time. But these are typical committees. It might look a little different at your library. But I would say that there are library boards that have bylaws that have not been reviewed in a very long time. And this is a really key area to take a look at, because if you've got committees that haven't met in like decades, you need to clean up your bylaws and get rid of those committees. Otherwise, you can be called out for not following your own bylaws, which when added to other missteps the board may have, it can be not good for the public reputation of the board and can be used by higher authorities to attempt to oust trustees over time. So clean up the bylaws, make sure they reflect reality. And again, be clear on the procedure for creating ad hoc committees, just in case you need those. So the intersection of committees with open meetings law, we just wanted to reiterate this. I know it was discussed when we had Kristen O'Neill from the Committee on Open Government last year, but I thought a little refresher might be good. Association libraries, most likely in New York State, your committees do not fall under open meetings law. You don't have to announce the meetings. You could meet online. You can have, I'm not going to give you any negative suggestions, although I've seen many interesting behavior by association committees, unless the caveat here is if you serve more than 1 million people. So obviously that's mostly downstate in the tri-li libraries, but upstate, that's possible in 1 or 2 cases. So just to keep that threshold in mind, if you serve less than 1 million people, you're an association library, committee meetings don't fall under open meetings law. Public libraries, your committees always fall under open meetings law. So that means announcing them to the public. It means holding them in an accessible location. It means following any video conferencing policy your board has passed about participation. It means having minutes of your committee meetings available within 2 weeks of that meeting. So all the same rules you follow for your board meetings must be followed by the committees. And the committees are defined whenever 2 or more members of your board get together to do business for the library, to have a discussion, to come to consensus on a recommendation for the board. So that might put a wrinkle in how you've been doing things, but now you know, and unfortunately you can't unknow something once we tell you. So now you've got that reference point for you. But this is where I wanted to bring up the situation for library boards that are on the smaller side. When you've got maybe only 5, 6, or 7 members on your board, having different configurations for committees may be challenging. So I just want to let you know that you can have members of your community that are not on the board serve on your committees. They may not be chairs of your committee. You always need to have a trustee as the chair of your committee. But to, again, spread the workload, you could have members of the committee, a community that you're looking to recruit for future board members or former board members who could help out at the committee level. Again, that's fine. You're just making recommendations to the board. They do not have authority unless the board has given them authority. So I would just put that little warning there that if you are using community members to augment your committee rosters, if the board were to authorize a committee to make decisions in between board meetings, I would be very careful about doing that if you have non-board members on that committee. You want to really keep the folks that have either been elected, appointed, or very officially chosen to be on your board to be those with the authority in those situations. So just beware in those situations. So I'm going to wrap up here, best practices for committees, then we'll get into your questions. I see an awful lot of questions have come in, which is not surprising, but that's great. So a couple of things that I'll say, I know I've learned along the way working with our boards here in the Mid-Hudson Library System and with the Mid-Hudson Library System board itself. Making sure your committees are clear on what their job actually is. Your bylaws may just say you have a facilities committee, and the facilities chair does their best to figure out what they're supposed to do. It'd be best to have a little purpose statement written that the facilities committee is charged with assisting the director with the oversight of the facilities, and it means an annual walkthrough and approving, grants that are written on behalf of the facility. You want to be specific about what their scope of work is. It's not going to cover everything they might do, but it gives them a general sense of purpose moving forward. Having an annual meeting to determine the goals of the committee per year can be helpful, not just kind of meeting to meet, but understanding why we're meeting and what our goals are for the year, and maybe figuring out how often we have to meet for the year, not just blindly meeting every month, because that's what we always do. That wastes a lot of precious time. So being deliberate, having goals, understanding the purpose of those committees can, again, streamline the work, make the agendas really clear. The committees know exactly what they're supposed to be reporting to your boards at the monthly meetings. You should have committee reports as a standing agenda item. Ideally, those are written reports, but we know sometimes time is of the essence and it's a little tough. So association libraries, you can get away with no written reports. I don't recommend it, but you could. But public libraries, you do have to have written committee reports that should be part of the board packet, part of the public record. Minutes, like I said, should be in that board packet. And then term limits for committee chairs, just like you do for officers and other members of your board, can be helpful. Maybe they can be the committee chair for 3 years, take a break, they could come back for another 3 years. But sometimes when you get someone who's been in that role for far too long, it can mean that the business of the committee is not necessarily being addressed as it should. And sometimes that person needs a break because it can also then grow other people on your board in terms of succession planning to take on those roles. And that's expected. That turnover really helps create a healthier environment for growing more leaders on your board who, once they get being a committee chair under their belt, may feel confident to step up into an officer role, secretary, treasurer, vice president, president. So again, thinking about growing leaders, succession planning, it's not saying a longtime committee chair isn't doing a good job. Maybe they're doing a great job, but having that mechanism to have turnover there is a very healthy thing. So Ron, I'm going to turn it over to you to see what kind of questions have come in so far. I saw the numbers spike during the treasurer thing, which is exactly what we thought would happen. So I'm curious to see what kind of questions we've got so far.
This may be a record number of questions that have come in on the Q&A while you were talking, Rebecca. So I'm pretty impressed. I'm actually going to jump right into the ones that we received in Q&A. The first one is, none of the staff at our library, including director, have had a review in more than 10 plus years. How do we broach this tricky subject, which I'm assuming broaching it with the board and then maybe even the personnel committee, depending on who's doing the evaluation of the director, which we also had a trustee handbook book club that talked about some of these topics as well, which you can always refer back to. But go ahead, Rebecca, what are your thoughts on this one?
So I think we're giving you a great excuse. You can say you came to this event, you read the trustee handbook, you understand this is a best practice, you'd like to introduce it at your board and in your institution. And, I think an important message to have going into that, and I hope this is the case in your situation, is that your director's doing a great job. And you just want them to continue to do a great job, and you want to document that you think they're doing a great job. And the same thing for the director to tell the staff moving forward. It's much easier to do this on a regular basis when things are going well, to create the pattern that you need so that if things do go sideways, you've got that pattern in place. So I would start out by not thinking it's going to be controversial, noting that it's best practice, and noting that it's helpful for a director and staff who are doing good work, and also creates that opportunity for really strong conversations to happen to make sure their needs are being met and your expectations are clear. So I would say go for it. Ron made the good kind of entry point to say your personnel committee would be the best place to start that, to investigate forms and process and bring your director in to talk about their thoughts on the matter. But we will reiterate things we said in those past sessions on this topic. Your director should be part of designing the evaluation process so they are crystal clear on what they're going to be evaluated against. You should not spring a form they've never seen on them and say, okay, we're doing your evaluation tomorrow. They need to understand, are they going to be measured against their job description, against long-range plan goals, against some other metric everyone has agreed on, and have they had 12 months to operate with that understanding so you can measure them against something they understood? So definitely a process, but I think something that most directors would be grateful for. To be honest with you, we usually hear from directors that are like, yeah, my board's never done that, so I've got nothing in my personnel file. When a new board comes in, they would much prefer to have a backlog of great evaluations that said this person is really strong in their position and helps this institution be successful. The tougher thing is when you've got a director that maybe is not performing at the standard you would like them to. When you try to introduce the performance evaluation and performance plans in an environment that's not ideal right now, that's where you may find there's more friction in introducing that practice in your institution.
That was great, Rebecca. And I really liked what you started out by using the Trustee Handbook Book Club as a tool to kind of broach some of these topics with your trustees or your board or your director, where, hey, we heard Rebecca talking about this. It'd be a good thing for us to look at. There's plenty of resources in the Trustee Handbook for you to use, so use them. It's great. All right, Rebecca, the next question that we have up here, and this sounds like it's talking about the 260D, the trustee education that you had mentioned earlier. The question is, how do I convince my president that the training is important when they don't think it is? I really don't want to, I really don't want this to be the second year in a row that I report on the annual report that all the trustees did not complete their training. Very frustrating and embarrassing. Any good talking points?
Yeah, it's not up to your opinion, it's the law. I'd probably start there. Do you have an opinion on following open meetings law? Do you have an opinion on Fair Labor Standards Act? Like, I don't care what your opinion is, it's the law. So you can comply with that law, or you can be on a path to being removed from your position. So I wouldn't start out maybe as confrontational as I am right here in my answer, but I would help educate your board that this is a law they are now required to follow, and it is tied to their reporting to the state, so it's very visible, and help them understand that it's not that onerous to come into compliance with it. It's only 2 hours a year, and Ron and Rebecca and Brian try to make it as fun as possible at the Trustee Handbook Book Club. So I think that that might be a place to start, is the education about the difference between law and opinion. But I also think your full board should embrace the idea of being in good standing with New York state law. That would be an important thing if you want to be an accountable and I think transparent board overall. Ron, have
Well,
you had to answer that? Have you had to help boards with that one so far?
I have, yeah, and
Yeah.
a lot of it is that's pretty much what it is there's you can read the law and there is a process for removal if people don't do this. So you really want to make sure that you have it. And it shows a level of responsibility for your library boards and respect for your library as a whole too, because you are a community asset. So why not have the governing body of that organization learn a few things about your fiduciary responsibility, how you're supposed to run meetings, what you're supposed to do with your resources, how to plan for your organization's future to make sure that you have a long-term sustainable organization that's going to exist indefinitely. Because it's not about individual trustees, it's about how boards change over time and create an institution that's actually a great resource for your community. And if a little bit of education can help with that, why not? I think it's great.
I think that's a great way to think about it. And I think, just reminding folks, it's not your library, it's the community's library. New York library trustees in New York State are responsible for over $1 billion in public funding. If you were on a school board, you'd be required to take far more than 2 hours of training. So you're getting away pretty light on a library board.
And I think what you said about the book club, Rebecca, I think Brian calculated the number of hours that we have of training on Mid Hudson's website right now. And I mean, by the end of the year, I think we'll be pushing close to 40 hours almost. So we got lots of training on a variety of topics that people would be interested in, hopefully. Okay, so William has a question. This one's about meeting minutes, Rebecca. So, do we amend the meeting minutes on the website after they are formally passed at the next board meeting?
Exactly right, William. So it would be a normal agenda item to approve the minutes of the past meeting. You'd review the draft. If there were any typos or someone says, hey, I wasn't at that meeting, but I'm listed, you make those changes. You vote on the final version, and the secretary and staff make sure that final version replaces the former draft version that's on the website. Exactly right.
Perfect. So the next one we have is also related to minutes. So our library video conferences the board meetings live via Zoom and broadcasts on Zoom. And then there's another comment. So they may broadcast on YouTube. So hopefully they have a policy that goes along with that to authorize it. And they're following the rules that are associated with open meetings law. But the question is, are we still bound on posting our meeting minutes on our website in draft form within the 2 weeks?
Yeah, those two things are actually unrelated in open meetings law. The video conferencing is a separate issue from your minutes. So even if there's a recording of your meeting available, there still needs to be written minutes of any actions taken at your board meeting posted on your website. And Ron, to your point, I saw you were trying to do double duty there, and remind people that there's two things that might be going on in that description of what the person just asked. You're broadcasting your meetings, which means the public could watch from any location, super convenient for people. There's a difference between that and a trustee attending via video conference. That you need to have a policy for, following the procedures found on the Committee on Open Government's website. You actually have to have a public hearing about that policy before your board adopts it, which is very different than how you adopt most policies. So put some thought into that if that's the situation that you're currently dealing with without a policy. It sounds like someone might be out of step with that then.
Okay, so the next one, William wrote in again. Can the president serve as the liaison with the treasurer? Also, we have two trustees review all bills warrants every month. Is the review by the board members sufficient?
Tackling William's first question there, the board president could be the liaison with the independent treasurer, but it would be better to separate that duties. The board president's job is big enough. I think having another volunteer on the board stepping up to be the finance officer, to be the liaison with the treasurer, would be a healthier situation. And again, spread out the responsibility, make the segregation of duties clearer, because there's also that kind of fear that the president may end up with too much power in a situation. And so that kind of lessens that likelihood. The other situation you describe in which just two trustees review the warrants before being paid, that's not adequate. But let me give you maybe a easy solution here. So you can have what we call a warrant officer, which maybe is one trustee who reviews the warrants in advance of the meeting and makes a recommendation to the full board and says, I have reviewed the warrants. I have asked questions on these items. You're welcome to take a look at them as well. But at this time, I would recommend we approve these. So you don't have to pass the warrant around to everybody at the meeting in that moment. But the board still has, the full board needs to have the right to see the warrants and ask questions about that before the full board approves them for payment. And just a reminder, the education law does require the board to approve them before payment. So that's where you want to have that board action in the minutes that says the full board reviewed these and accepted them for payment.
Well said. Okay, Stephen King has a question. I'm assuming he's not the author, but you never know. Maybe we've reached a wider audience. That'd be
I
kind of cool.
think Stephen King is one of my trustees here at Mid-Hudson
Oh,
High, Stephen.
nice. Very good. So Stephen's asking, can you please address oath of office? We have never done this. Is it all trustees or only officers?
So oath of office technically only applies to public libraries, Stephen. And Stephen, if it's the Stephen, I think, is from an association library, which is why you have not done it. So I would say by the letter of the law, public library trustees must take the oath of office, as do directors of public libraries. In the association library setting, there is no requirement for you to do so. I, however, like the practice because I think it reminds us all that we are held to a high standard in the service that we are providing to our public. So association libraries don't have to, but it might be a good activity to work into your annual meeting agenda, just to remind everyone we're taking an oath to follow laws and do our best on behalf of our communities.
Very good. Okay, next question comes from Gary. If a school district public library has a treasurer and a bookkeeper, do you have a model list for separating duties? If a school district public library decides it can't afford an independent treasurer, which in the question it says an option allowed by the New York State Comptroller, how should duties be split?
I don't think I can give you the list here during this workshop, but I think you could figure it out. So if you look at the typical duties of a treasurer and the typical duties of a bookkeeper, as a board, I would review those. I would take a look at where is there opportunity for one of my favorite words of all time, malfeasance. Where could there be collusion? Where do we want to make sure insert a third person into this situation, whether it's the director or another staff person or another trustee? So just using common sense to walk through the common activities of receiving funds, of dispersing funds, of managing online accounts, of managing investments, who has access to what when, who's signing off on things, who's receiving packages. Let's just parse out each of those processes and make sure there's a good segregation of duties, regardless of the title of the person involved in that particular duty.
Thank you, Rebecca. What report should we be getting from our treasurer? What are they bringing to the board meeting?
So you've got an itemized list in the trustee handbook, but I would say that you should be seeing an accounting of all accounts, making sure you're seeing they've been reconciled each month. You should be seeing an expenditure and revenue receipt report that shows you what money has come in as compared to your adopted budget and what money has been expended as per your adopted budget. You'll see in the trustee handbook, we recommend that those reports very clearly show a year-to-date expended column. So a layperson on a board can quickly understand, or year-to-date received column. So you can quickly see like the money we expected to come in is coming in, or boy, it's October and we only have 50% of our money that we expected to have this year. What's going on? So again, you want to be able to understand cash flow in, cash flow out. The bank statements, again, should be reconciled, and then the warrant list of payments to be made. Those would be the three main reports that you have. And I'll just throw in here the accounting of the reconciliation of your bank accounts. You should see all of your bank accounts, not just like the savings or checking account. If you've got a capital fund that's in a segregated account, or you've got a fund over here, the endowment fund, you're making sure you understand all the accounts that are held in the library's name, and that you see a regular accounting of those would be important, in addition to what's normally called the treasurer's report, which is giving you kind of the it's used an accounting term, right? It's accruals. It's like showing you what money that you should have, how it's been encumbered, and how it's actually been expended. You should also see that accounting of the actual bank statements themselves and any investments that you have.
Just said investments, which cues up the next question
Oh.
perfectly. Are there best practices for investing money that a library has?
So this starts with understanding what type of library you are. And then the next thing to understand is, where did that money come from? So association libraries, and this is different from when these laws were written, but most association libraries, at least here in the middle of the state, are now receiving the bulk of their operating funds through public money. And the general municipal law rules around investment are designed to protect public money. So when you think about investments as an association library, I'd like you to segregate in your mind the difference between public money and private money. If you've had a ton of donations come in, or you want to build an endowment fund with private donations, you can invest that in high risk vehicles for investment. Go for it. Just have a policy the board has agreed to, and probably a financial advisor to advise you on the markets in those situations. Public money, I would not take any risk with. I would use general municipal law, even as an association library, to use the vehicles that are allowed in those situations, which are few in number, but are not risky. You know you're going to get a return, but you also know you can get your money back pretty quickly at the level the public meant for you to receive it. Public libraries must follow general municipal law for public and private dollars. The minute you touch private money as a public library, it becomes public money. So all money received as the public library must follow general municipal law investment rules, which really, I think it locks it down to maybe three choices you have. The most high yield option you're going to have is probably going to be a CD at your local bank. But there are some new vehicles that have emerged recently that the library community is getting more familiar with. Pooling money with other municipal agencies through the New York Liquid Assets Fund may be something your library has enough funding to invest short term in. So you may want to investigate that for higher yield options in the future. Again, that was the New York Liquid Assets Fund. But I think public libraries, you don't have a lot of options for investments. Association libraries, you want to have a really strong investment policy in addition to following general municipal law for your public money.
Well said. And the Office of State Comptroller has a guidebook that you can read through, which is really handy. It's called Investing and Protecting Public Funds. It has kind of a model policy towards the end, which you'll have to customize for your library a bit, depending on how you're going to use it. But it's a good resource to be able to use at your local library. Okay, let's see here. The next question we have are who are typically hired as independent treasurers, accountants or bookkeepers?
I think that's usually the case. If you're in a civil service environment, you'll see it's actually a civil service category. But yes, most likely folks who have at least an associate's degree in accounting or actually a business as a bookkeeper. Certainly accountants can be your independent treasurer, but it must be a specific accountant at a firm. You can't name a firm, a CPA firm as your independent treasurer. It has to be a specific person at the firm has been hired as the independent treasurer.
Okay, we have another one on minutes. So do we need to take minutes for a working meeting? Full board is looking at a proposal and discussing the merits, but does not make any motions.
So a working group or a working meeting, if you were to talk to the Committee on Open Government about how to classify what falls under open meetings law, they're going to tell you anytime a quorum of your board gets together to discuss the business of the library, even if you're not going to make a decision. What you are doing is you are having a discussion that helps you come to an understanding that allows you to make a decision, which in the intention of open meetings law would mean the public has the right to watch that discussion, to understand how you came to the conclusion that you did. So really the only time that the board, more than a quorum of the board, can get together and not fall under open meetings law would probably be for training like this, where you are learning together, but you're not discussing the specifics of your library in the middle of the session, unless you have got like a group text chain going on talking about the independent treasurer and what to do. So I'd be very careful about saying a working session doesn't fall under open meetings law. Most likely it does, and there would need to be minutes of that meeting as well as having it announced to the public.
And this next question goes along with that one too, Rebecca, because this is talking about the full board. If a board committee includes a quorum of the board members, does open meetings law apply?
Yeah, it automatically triggers open meetings law, even for association libraries.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, here's one. So Suzanne has a question. What is a member at large in relation to the executive committee?
Sure. So the executive committee is traditionally made up of the officers of the board, and education law requires there to be 5 members of an executive committee, and the traditional officer positions only number 4. So adding a member at large position to the executive committee to create that 5th seat on the executive committee would be called for. So in some cases, boards write in the immediate past president to be that 5th person on the executive committee, or in the absence of the immediate past president, they'll name a member at large that's chosen from the rest of the roster of the trustees to be named to the executive committee.
Good explanation. That was great, Rebecca.
Oh,
Thank you.
thanks. I just had to explain it to my own board, so I had some practice.
Perfect. Well done. Another executive committee one. So we only have 7-member board. Can the whole board serve as the executive committee?
I think you've almost answered your own question. I think in that situation, the executive committee model doesn't make a lot of sense, right? You've got a small enough board that you're probably just going to convene and do the work that you need to do as a group. Hopefully with a smaller number of folks, it's easier to find a date to meet on short notice. But if you had a 5-member board, it triggers open meetings law, right? Because you've got a quorum in place now. So the executive committee structure doesn't work as cleanly with the smaller size board that you may have. But that was a very astute question.
Absolutely. Okay. Leslie has one for the treasurer. So regarding treasurer related issues, let's say I, as a board member, feel generally intimidated by financials, but there is a strong understanding and attending to them by other members. Am I being irresponsible by not addressing my own ignorance? Asking for a friend.
So
Well,
you're speaking for probably 3,000 of the 6,000 trustees across New York who are like, I do the same thing, but I would never say it out loud.
those are her
Um,
friends, so
yeah,
we're
yeah. So
good.
I would say that most of the time we do trustee education and we talk to folks, most people admit they're trusting the treasurer to know what they're doing. And they're just kind of like, sounds good. But I do think it is important that we take responsibility as board members to understand the finances of our organizations. So asking a few key questions, I would actually start by asking for an orientation to the reports by the treasurer. Sit down one-on-one, have them walk you through them, ask your questions in that environment, and then do your best to follow along when those reports come out. And again, ask clarifying questions when you don't quite understand something. But I do think you should question until you understand as a trustee, even if you're not on the finance committee or the treasurer or the finance officer. I do think all trustees have a fiduciary responsibility to understand the general sense of the finances and to know the questions to ask. And actually, what I'll do, I'll ask Laura to send you a list of the questions you should be able to answer as a general member of the board about the library's finances. That's something we use here in Mid-Hudson with our education for trustees. Understanding the basics about the finances, those questions, if you can answer them, you're in pretty good shape. And then if you're looking at the financial reports and it's just not clicking for you, listening very hard, asking some key questions about the health of the organization will make you feel like you're doing your job as the fiduciary oversight for the board. But I watched an institution in recent past that's not a library, but related, it's library adjacent, where the board of trustees had just kept rubber stamping the financial reports. They were like, yep, sounds like that person knows what they're talking about. Oh, trust that person to do the right thing. And little did they know, things were not going well. And they were not asking just simple key questions that would have revealed the really dire straits the organization was heading towards. And so I do think it's everyone's responsibility on the board to ask some key questions, to pay attention during that report, get an orientation to the reports. And even if you don't understand absolutely everything about them, being part of the overall team that's asking good questions minimizes the chances of something really devastating happening in the organization.
And I think asking this type of question is kind of the first step in this whole understanding the financial health and the operations of your library too. So I think first step is get in there, ask some key questions like Rebecca had said, and you may not all understand it in the first board meeting, but you learn a little bit. You'll learn a little bit more at the next board meeting. You may need to start. I had one trustee who, because as libraries, we're always speaking in acronyms about all the bills that we have to pay and everything else. And one of the trustees started to create kind of a glossary of all the acronyms that pop up in our budget and what they mean. So she had a better understanding, and then she shared it with the rest of the board. And they were like, and trustees who have been on there for years were like, oh, I never knew what that meant. So asking this question will help other trustees. So this is a really great first step, I think.
Yeah, I made a note for myself when you said that because I also have a glossary that I can send folks. And not every single term will map to what we do in libraries, but I think it gets the basics of financial speak into your hands that could be helpful. So I'll send that as well as those financial questions you should be able to answer.
Nice. Okie doke. Next one. Can a president direct an item be placed on the agenda?
Most likely, yes. I think that, what goes on your agenda, it should be pretty clear. You should have a standard agenda. There's a recommended one in the trustee handbook. And then business that's coming out of committee or is continued discussion should be on there. But sometimes the board president needs to use their own discretion to add a time-sensitive issue onto the board agenda, but should do so sparingly. And what I mean by that is that there should be a very clear reason why that's not on there. It shouldn't just be like a cool idea they had last week. Like it should be something that like, you know what, I was at this meeting of the Rotary. It came to my attention that XYZ about our institution. I think we need to talk about this as a group. Right? It needs to be timely. It needs to be very tied to the goals of the library. It shouldn't just be because I thought it would be cool. That should really come through committee or be discussed offline before it makes it onto the board's agenda. But yeah, I would say the board president in general has that prerogative, but should use it wisely.
I think that's a really good way to answer it. And usually one of the questions that comes up for some boards is the board president kind of they are the ruler of everything. But I like to say that the board president doesn't necessarily have more authority, but they do have more responsibility in making sure that that communication is happening back and forth so trustees feel heard, items are appropriate that are on the agenda and timely, like Rebecca had said, and then you're able to move those conversations forward into the board meeting. Okay, and a five-member board, so another little board. Who, president or director, is responsible for drafting board policy and putting them on the agenda for review?
So I believe we talked a little bit about this during the policy session, and you'll find in the trustee handbook a little chart at the end called Working Together. Usually it's the director who will draft a policy that from scratch that you don't currently have, or point out that you need to amend an existing policy because of a change of law or circumstance in your institution. So I would say normally it's the director bringing that to your attention and doing the legwork to research the policy and draft it for your consideration or a policy committee's consideration. But again, in really tiny libraries, there's certainly libraries in this state where you've got folks that are working less than part-time. It may mean trustees are stepping up to help draft policies, but I'd say in a fully staffed library, pretty robust board and staff, that the director would normally take the lead in drafting policies because they're your technical expert on most topics of policy.
Rebecca, every time we answer a question, like three more pop up. This is wild. This is a good one. Okay. This is about term limits, Rebecca. So are the term limits for officers the same for every library, or does individual libraries determine the term as stated in their bylaws?
The latter. Folks determine that in your bylaws, and that's a group discussion of how best to handle that in your situation. You can also waive it in certain circumstances if the full board agrees. And I can think of only limited circumstances in which that would happen. But I had a situation about 20 years ago in which a library, an association library, was working to raise money to expand their building. It was something that fundraising consultants told them could never be done. And one of the trustees got super torqued about that and said, well, I don't believe that. I'm going to make this happen. And ended up chairing the capital campaign committee for like 13 years. The board had to keep waiving their term limits so she could keep doing the amazing work she was doing to raise tens of millions of dollars to make it so. But no, term limits are a local decision for officers. Just a note here, for public library trustees, you may not have term limits in general for trustees, but association libraries, you can. So that's recommended best practice for any type of board. But the publicly elected trustees and appointed trustees at municipal, school, and special district public libraries, you can't have term limits in general for the general trustee seats.
Okay, Vera is the chair of their Finance, Treasury, and Audit Committee. I think you may have talked about this a bit already, Rebecca, but could you define the role of the committee as best you can? And let's see here. And am I the finance officer? Okay, so she's asking if she's the finance officer, looking for some explanation of the finance and audit committees that she's chair of.
So in many circumstances, the chair of the finance committee is probably the appointed treasurer or finance officer of the board. That would be a good connection to have, because then you've got a committee of folks on the board that are helping you do that work and sort through policies and other thorny issues that come up. But you would know if you were the finance officer because the board would vote to appoint you to that role, as well as appoint the rosters for the committees.
Are there additional resources for new board presidents? Man, we got a lot of resources that we've created for the past couple of years, Rebecca. Which one is the highlights for new board presidents that you would like?
I hate to say this, but there used to be a great webinar for board presidents on the state library website, but when they reorganized the site, they lost they haven't maybe added back in some of those great webinars that Jerry did many years ago. So that's a good reminder to me to ask the staff at the state library to see if we can get those webinars back on their website. I would recommend the one Jerry did for board presidents, but if we can't get that there, we'll produce a new one for you. But I think in general, you could just do a Google search on the role of a nonprofit board president, and you'll get some really strong advice from organizations like the Council of Nonprofits, the National Council on Nonprofits, Blue Avocado, all sorts of agencies that do support work for general nonprofits. Lots of good advice for just leading a board in general, not necessarily specific to libraries in New York State, but I think very good advice in general.
All right. My board hasn't been approving minutes. I'm a brand new to my board. How do I push to make sure that we start doing this?
So as the great Maya Angelou said, once you know better, you do better, right? So now you know, so you can bring that to the board and let them know that by law, by actual New York State law, the board needs to approve the minutes and make sure that becomes a standing item on the agenda. So maybe working to make sure you've got an agenda template that gets used on a regular basis, and that's a standing item there.
I think the template sample in the trustee handbook has approval of the agenda, approval of the minutes.
That's
It's
right.
boom, first two actions of every board meeting. Okay, what's the process for filling a vacancy on the board?
Hmm. Well, that depends on what type of library you are. If you're an association library, it's actually pretty straightforward. You can create your own process for recruiting and appointing trustees to the board. I'll actually add this into the follow-up materials. One of our libraries here in Mid-Hudson, the Patterson Library in Putnam County, has a fantastic process, very visible on their website, to describe what it means to be on the board, an application to apply to be on the board. They have a committee that interviews folks and then makes recommendations for folks to be on that board. But an association library setting, you really control. They call it being self-perpetuating board, where you are choosing the others that come onto the board, which probably reflects the experience you had getting on that board. Municipal libraries, it's more complicated. It can depend on your relationship with the municipality, but at the end of the day, your municipality actually appoints people to the board. Many municipalities, they take the recommendations of the existing board of who should come on the board, and they just say, sounds good, go for it. Other times it's more political, and they are making more political appointments to the board. So that may look quite different from library to library in the municipal public library setting. And then school district public libraries and special district public libraries, those trustees are elected by the people of that district. So there can be recruitment to make sure people are aware of the opportunity, they understand how to run for the board, but the ultimate decision is made by the voters.
Well said. Rebecca, do we have sample documents for board self-evaluation and the director evaluation?
Yes, we do. Yeah,
I
you'll
was,
find references in the trustee handbook to where you can find some samples.
and then I was also thinking about the personnel trustee handbook book club that we did, and that was one where Brian, our other co-moderator, put together a post-session toolkit with lots of additional resources, and I can drop that link in chat for you that you can
Oh,
look at.
perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see here. I've been on the board for 8 years now. We have never done a board of, oh, okay, where can we find six? Okay, we just, oh, perfect. All
Oh,
right,
sweet.
here we go. Look at that. Two in a row. Nice. That one was good. We're almost at the point where we've answered more questions than we have, but we're not there yet, Rebecca. So
Good thing we're doing that after party in this.
this is just going to be a officers and committees like part two. That's basically what it's going to be. Okay. Let's see here. So Mary has a question. The village manages the library's operational account. These funds are not in a separate account, possibly a sub-account. Your thoughts on, should it be separate account for segregation of funds? Should the library receive a bank statement monthly? Assuming they're a municipal library, probably.
Sounds like it. But education law is actually very clear that in this case, if the municipality is holding the funds, it must be in a separate account. So there must be separate accounting for it, and the money must be turned over to you upon request of the library treasurer. So yes, I think in this situation, it sounds like the treasurer of the municipality may also be your treasurer, and they should absolutely be giving you monthly reports on the status of those finances.
Okay. This is another executive committee question that I believe we answered earlier. Is the member at large of the executive committee a voting member of the group? Which you had said that the member at large is a member of the board that's appointed, so they would be a voting member of
That's
that
right.
committee. Okay. How many of the past presentations are on video for educational purposes? Are these available? Absolutely. And we can post that link in there. So all the trustee handbook book club sessions that we've done have been recorded, and they are available on Mid-Hudson Library's website. We'll drop the link in the chat so you can click on those and watch all the past ones.
And I just want to say for folks that are in the Mid-Hudson Library System that are on this session, you should look at the training on demand platform and take those recordings there, because you'll get automatic proof of attendance for watching those recordings if you're a member of the Mid-Hudson Library System.
Right. Here's one that comes up, at least when this first came out, I was asked this question a lot, Rebecca. Does the sexual harassment training count towards the trustee trainings, the 2-hour requirement?
The answer is no.
No, it does not.
And just to expand upon that, the intent, those are two separate laws with two separate intentions. So that is very clearly not part of the trustee education, satisfying the trustee education requirement. So that will be in addition to your 2 hours of trustee education.
And the sexual harassment training is also New York State law. So lots of laws flying around here for your education. This run must be, these questions must have come in when you started talking about the trustee education piece of it. Does trustee training have to be live, or do recorded webinars count?
Recorded webinars can count as long as they're from a pre-approved provider. So the law outlines, and the implementation guidance from the state library outlines which providers are authorized to provide you with that trustee education. Whether or not it's live or recorded does not matter. It's really more about what your board requires in terms of proof of attendance. That's the bigger question.
And the Division of Library Development does have a sample policy that they have on their website, as well as a good rundown of all the information that you would need for that. Okie doke. Do we need to advertise committee meetings the same as board meetings?
If you're a public library, yes. And if you're an association library serving more than 1 million people, yes, but otherwise, no.
This question makes me feel like I'm not prepared for AI to take over our world, but what are your thoughts on using generative AI to put together meeting minutes?
Give it a try, see what happens.
Why not?
I mean, you got to have a human, right, reviewing that to make sure it actually captured the actions the board took. And there's going to be a human signing off on those minutes saying, yes, this was an accurate accounting of what happened at this meeting.
Let's see here. Regarding minutes, when did the rule go into effect? And would you please review the standard or tell us where we can find that information? So I'm guessing that's the open meetings law section of just meeting minutes in general.
So you've always been required to take minutes through public officers law, which is where you find New York State open meetings law. What's changed is that you now must post them on your website, and that changed within the past 5 years, I would say. So there was a significant modernization of open meetings law that was, I would say, accelerated during COVID as they were contending with the realities of allowing meetings to happen online during that era. Don't we all miss that era? But I would say that you've always had to have minutes. They've always had to be available within 2 weeks of the meeting. And it used to be in print at the library, but now it's required to be posted online within 2 weeks, which is relatively new.
Right. Rachel is providing us with a lot of background information on her situation. So I'll go through this real quickly. It sounds like they do a pretty good job at thinking through their committee structures. So their library has 4 regular committees, and they're assigned when they come onto the board. They assign based on interests, skill sets, balancing the number of people to get the work done, which they do very well. Sounds like a pretty high functioning board, which is great. We're trying to decide if it would be helpful to offer a way to change committees, possibly every 2 years, in case interests change, space opens up, committee members don't work well together, or for any other reason. What is a good procedure for deciding how to offer this change? Whose preference gets the most weight? Board members can always join another committee if they're interested, but we do like to have 2 to 3 board members on each committee. If someone wants to leave a committee, we'd like to give them a way to do this, so that it's fair for redistribution, might be if redistribution is necessary. Are we overthinking this?
I don't think you're overthinking it. I think that it's a strong practice to have an annual review of the committee rosters. And so I'll just describe the process that we use here at Mid-Hudson, where our board president puts a call out to our board. Which committees would you like to serve on next year? Do you want to stay where you are? Would you like a change? Do you want to be chair? Do you want to continue to be chair? Getting feedback from everyone. And then the board president puts together a proposed roster using that feedback for the board to approve at the beginning of the the calendar year, which is also our fiscal year. So that allows for movement between committees, or for a chair to say, you know what, I'm really done being chair here. I'd like to step down. So it invites that opportunity on an annual basis to refresh that. So I do think that's a healthy thing to do. I don't think you should be assigned to a committee in perpetuity.
Okay. And I think, so Rebecca's question that was next, I think you had answered that. So does the board need to take a vote to approve committee assignments at the January board meeting? So when you had said that an annual review of the meeting, having those appointments at that time makes perfect sense.
Yep.
Okay. Should the oath of office be taken every year by every trustee?
Great question. So the law only requires a public library trustee to take the oath of office at the start of your term. So your term may be 3 years, it may be 5 years, but you would take the oath at the beginning of your term. And technically, you don't have to take it again till you re-up for another term. But many boards choose to have all trustees do it every year for the exact purpose that I described before. And well, I'll tell you the real secret is it's just easier for record keeping purposes to just have everyone do it every year. But it also is that kind of group experience where we're taking this oath together. We're all acknowledging that our job is to follow the rules and uphold the Constitution and do our best by our community. So you got your technical answer, you got your best practice answer there.
And also, when you have new trustees join the board, it's always awkward to have the whole board watching them take that oath. So why not do it together?
Sure.
That sounds good. I like that answer. Um, Susan wants to know, how do we get a printed copy of the trustee handbook?
So you should contact your local public library system. Most of them have a stash of the printed version of the handbook. We are almost out here at Mid-Hudson. I have like 20 left. So if you don't have one yet, you better ask soon, because soon there will not be any more.
Mhm. What kind of reporting might a treasurer receive from their foundation? Is there any standard, or is this or no, because this is a private?
So it sounds like this library has a separately incorporated foundation, a charitable foundation that's raising money for the library as a separate entity. And this is a sticky situation, both for separately incorporated foundations and separately incorporated friends groups. Many of you have friends groups that are separately incorporated 501c3 charitable organizations. Neither of them have a legal requirement to report to you, but we all know they should report to you because they are fundraising in your name. So having a memo of understanding between the foundation and the library board, between the library board and the friends group, is 100% recommended. If you need an example of a memo of understanding between a library and a friends group, you can get that from United for Libraries, which is the division of the American Library Association that supports library boards, friends groups, and foundations. So again, I think that's a diplomatic effort to be transparent between organizations, because I'll tell you, the members of the public, they do not understand the difference between a foundation, the library board, and the friends group. So as a library board, you want to have a very good relationship with a separate entity that's doing fundraising in your name. So there is financial transparency, and you are confident there are strong financial controls in place in that auxiliary organization that's raising money in your name. I do believe that for public libraries, when you are audited, they audit that auxiliary funding group as well. So there should be some third-party oversight there, but I think on a monthly basis, you want that transparency as well. So there should be a liaison from your board assigned to that board, and vice versa. So there should be a regular agenda item on both entities' meetings to hear from each other and to see each other's financial reports.
And if you have had an MOU in place, take a look at it after a while, especially if there's an expiration on it, review it, make sure everything's in there. Take a look at United for Libraries, make sure all those aspects are in there. In regard to travel expenses to board meetings, is it unethical for trustees to be reimbursed, especially for Uber, etc.?
I would say it's not common practice for travel reimbursement for a local library board. I think for regional boards, like a public library system board, like my board, we cover 3,000 square miles. Some of my trustees drive 2 hours to come to the meeting. There's an equity issue there. But for a municipal size library district, I would not think that's a reasonable cost to reimburse. But that's your board's decision. If you're finding that's a barrier to board recruitment, you might decide to do so. But that would be a board decision.
This one goes back to committees and minutes, what we had talked about earlier. So our committees give a report at the board meeting. A summary of the report is included in the minutes. Is that sufficient, or does a committee have to have minutes? We don't have anyone to take minutes. Can the director do it?
So remember, going back to which committees fall under open meetings. If you're a public library with committees, you fall under open meetings law, which means you do have to produce minutes if any actions are taken. So if your committee comes to consensus to make a recommendation to the board, there should be written minutes of that meeting. Saying that no one wants to take minutes is not a valid excuse. Someone has to take minutes. That's part of the job to be in compliance with open meetings law in that setting. Association libraries, what was described would probably work fine.
Rebecca, we are just about at 6:30 and we have answered 41 questions tonight, which may be a record. That's a lot of questions to get through. So I just want to say I appreciate so much everybody's attendance and their questions and their engagement. As a reminder, we'll be recording the trustee handbook after party in December, so keep a lookout for that. And then we'll kick off 2025 with a book club on advocacy Wednesday, January 22nd at 5 p.m. Information will be out on that as well as on the Mid-Hudson Library website. So I hope you register and you can stop by and listen to us talk about advocacy for a bit. And you can find all the resources for tonight as well as past sessions at midhudson.org/trustee book club. I want to thank everybody again. And Rebecca, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with all these questions. And I hope you and everybody who attended has a fantastic evening tonight.